Well, good afternoon everyone and welcome to our webinar, What's New in 2017. Can't promise to have a crystal ball, but we do hope that you'll find this a useful and informative session and that you'll pick up a few practical tips or things to think about as we run through what's ahead for us this year. My name is Alison Blackhurst. I'm HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions and I will be leading the session. And I'm joined today by Sue Watson, my colleague, who is HR Operations Manager. Good afternoon, Sue.
Hello there and hello everybody. Yes, welcome to this webinar. I'm here to field any technical problems, which hopefully none of us will have, but just in case, I'm there. So if you do have a problem, send a message through the chat on your webinar panel. Also, if you have any questions about what's new in 2017, then do send a message through and we will try and respond to them either during the webinar or at the end if we have time. And if we don't have time, we will ensure we send you a response directly. So do ask some questions if there's something burning that we haven't covered. Thank you.
Now, we do have a lot to get through today, so I will be covering this in whistle-stop timing, but in roughly chronological order. We'll be looking at trade union ballots, tribunal processes, increases in the minimum wage and also other statutory rates, the changes in terms of what has to be covered for gender pay gap reporting, the apprenticeship levy, salary sacrifice schemes, foreign workers and the immigration skills charge, public sector exit payments, data protection, employment status and rights, and also modern slavery and public sector procurement. And I guess no webinar will be complete today without a mention of Brexit, especially since that's what you're all going to be watching on the news tonight probably. But before we start in terms of 2017, let's just take a quick recap on what happened last year. Last year we had some major changes in terms of employment law. Firstly, we had the introduction of the national living wage, which was a huge increase for some employers. Now, quite a number of our clients decided that they were actually going to pay the national living wage to all of their employees because they found the administration of handling so many different rates of pay, depending on your age, just too onerous. But for those that didn't, they would have had to put in new systems for capturing the 25th birthday of their employees. We also had the first modern slavery statements. This applies to employees with a turnover of 36 million or more who are required to put on their websites in a prominent place their modern slavery statement, the steps they were taking to ensure that they had no modern slavery within their workforce. Throughout the whole year, we had the ongoing legal action about holiday pay and commission and overtime payments, and we still haven't reached the end of the road on that. The Lock case is still being appealed further, so despite the fact that most of us are coming round to the idea now that holiday pay should reflect normal pay, and therefore for those who earn considerable amounts of regular commission or overtime, their holiday pay should reflect this. We still do not have any definite guidance as to what the pay periods are and how much overtime or how much commission constitutes normal pay and this sort of thing. We also had a lot of cases last year relating to employment status within the gig economy. Everybody has now heard of Sports Direct, and I guess everybody has heard of Uber as well. They do say that there's no such thing as bad publicity. In the case of Sports Direct, I'm not entirely convinced about that, but we all now know about the workers that were working and the breaches of the national minimum wage there. And of course we had the momentous Brexit vote, which has not yet impacted on our employment laws, but hot off the press today, the Supreme Court has decided that the government does not have the power to trigger Article 50. So therefore the UK Parliament is going to have to vote on this, both through the Commons and the Lords. This may delay the process somewhat. It's unlikely to mean that it doesn't happen though. And we also await the Great Repeal Bill, which will convert all of our current EU employment law into domestic law. So will at least provide us with some stability whilst the exit process is worked through. And then on top of all of that, we had case law, which, as ever, continued to develop with lots of cases, particularly on disability discrimination. I think that came up in our newsletter, 2 or 3 cases every single month without fail. And also we had some very large value equal pay cases going through the courts. We thought that was a quiet year. I've got an awful lot of slides to get through, so I will be going at speed, but there seems to be just as much ahead for us in 2017. Now, the first out of all of these will be the Trade Union Act. This applies to all unionised workforces, and we now have new regulations. They are still draft, but these will help to bring the Trade Union Act 2016 into force. Now, the regulations are the Important Public Services Health Regulations 2017. They're expected to come into force on the 1st of March, but if Parliament hasn't approved them by that time, which actually may be likely now given that Brexit will probably take precedence over other things, then they will come into force 21 days after they are approved. But irrespective of the actual date, we know that we're looking at significant changes to union balloting for industrial action. Now, for any action to be lawful, a vote for action will in future require a 50% minimum turnout and a simple majority in vote of the industrial action. So if you have, for example, 100 employees being balloted, at least 50 of those must vote, i.e. 50%, and 26 or more must vote in favour of the action. However, for those who are normally engaged in what is now known as important public services, that's health, education, fire and transport, 40% of eligible voters will need to vote in favour of the action. So if you have your 100 members that you're balloting, at least 50 of those must vote, but at least 40 of them must vote in favour of the action. So we have a significantly higher threshold for those who are normally engaged in important public services. Which is why I guess we need to get it right as to who these people actually are. So the regulations define the people that are involved in important public services. And they are pretty well what you would expect in the sense of for health. It's services in hospitals such as A&E, high dependency units, intensive care, psychiatric services, obstetric and midwifery services for conditions which require immediate attention in order to prevent serious injury, illness or loss of life. It also includes the emergency ambulance services. However, services that are provided in a private hospital or by a private ambulance service are excluded. For education, we're looking at teaching and other services provided by teachers and head teachers for children of compulsory school age, for those in a 16 to 19 academy or at a further education institution. But again, fee-paying schools and further education institutions where the majority of compulsory school-age pupils are funded by individuals, those are excluded. Firefighting, well, it's those who are involved in extinguishing fires, protecting life and property in the event of fires, and also all of the people provided by the fire and rescue authorities to deal with and organise a response to requests for such services. And transport services includes the London local bus services. It includes the national passenger rail and tramway services, some of the network and station services, air traffic control, civil air traffic control that is, airport and port security services. But services which start and end outside Great Britain are excluded. Now it also covers certain border control services in respect of the entry and exit of people and goods to and from the UK. And it was envisaged originally that those who are involved in the decommissioning of nuclear installations and the management of radioactive waste and the spent fuel sector would be covered. But at the moment, the regulations don't mention the latter. Now, how's that going to affect us? Well, it was interesting to think whether this is actually timely or not. When this law was first mooted, I mean, I can remember giving a talk about this a year ago now, and actually the level of industrial action was really quite low at that stage, and the question was, you know, is this really going to make too much difference? Is it a sledgehammer to crack a nut? But the way things are going at the moment, it does seem that this law is now going to be much more needed, and it could well be that unions change their tactics and turn to more targeted action, for example. But note that under the new law, for example, the recent Southern Rail and the London Underground strikes would have fallen under the tighter rules. However, the British Airways cabin crew strike would not. So turning to tribunal processes and fees now, well, everybody will know, I'm assuming, that the level of claims fell dramatically following the introduction of fees a couple of years ago. Now, the arguments about this are still rumbling on, but in the meantime, the government is consulting on changes to the entire employment tribunal process. It published an open consultation on this. This is a DBEIS document, and they are looking at ways of making the system more just, proportionate and accessible. Now they're looking at a whole range of things here. Basically, the sort of changes that are under consideration include online processing and delegating some of the routine or procedural decision-making tasks that are currently undertaken by judges to caseworkers, and tailoring the panels according to the expertise and qualifications of the panel members, and ensuring that simple cases can be resolved simply. Now, the consultation closed at the end of last week on the 21st of January, so it may well be that there are changes as a result of that. In the meantime, Unison is still carrying on with its battle against the introduction of employment tribunal fees, and the next challenge is due to be heard in the Supreme Court on the 27th and the 28th of March. So that's the date of the hearing. It's not sure when the outcome will be released. And irrespective of all of those, another thing that employers should be aware of is that a new online database of employment tribunal decisions is expected to go live early this year. Now, if you face a tribunal, what happens at the end of it is you actually get quite a long transcript explaining the case and the points that were made and the judge's reasoning as to why they did what they did. They can be quite lengthy to read through, but sometimes there are interesting bits and sometimes there are quite humorous bits in all of this. But basically, the public is going to have access to all of these details without having to pay and without having to send off and get copies of transcripts. So therefore, it is sensible to consider how well you undertake your grievance or disciplinary hearings and to ensure that any details that are disclosed are going to show your business in a professional light. In line with other initiatives in terms of using transparency to drive change, something like this is likely to mean that, for example, people may well look at these decisions in terms of recruitment and retention. Shareholders may look at them. Potential investors may look at them. So therefore, the online database of decisions, whilst it will be very useful to HR people and to lawyers, it's also something that, because the public will have access to these details, we need to be careful about that. Now, we know in April that we have increases to some of the statutory rates. The largest and the most concerning of those is probably the increase in the national living wage, which goes up to £7.50 an hour from April 2017. Now, that applies to all payments made in pay periods on or after the 1st of April. The Low Pay Commission was asked to recommend rates which would move the national living wage closer to 60% of median earnings, with an aim to getting this up to £9 an hour by 2020, and also to recommend rates for the other rates that still reflect the economy and that don't price people out of jobs. So what we see here is that the gap is widening between the national living wage and the other national minimum wage rates. We have an increase of 30p in the national living wage and just 5 or 10p in the others. Is that age discrimination? Well, yes it is, but this is the government that's doing it. Now, the rate that's paid is whatever is applicable at the beginning of the pay period. So if you pay monthly and someone is 24 at the beginning of April with a 25th birthday on, say, the 15th of the month, then that person wouldn't be entitled to the increase until the following month, although there's nothing to stop you giving it early as a birthday present. But you do need to ensure that you keep a close eye on ages and budget accordingly for this. Interestingly, the new national living wage rate is still lower than the actual living wage, which is at £8.45 and £9.75 for London. Now, just to recap, we still have lots of cases about the minimum wage, what is included or excluded, and pay for the purposes of national minimum wage calculations includes gross pay, commission and bonuses. It does not include overtime, allowances, expenses, tips or gratuities, and neither does it include benefits in kind. The sort of hiccups that come up in terms of national minimum wage claims are not always employers who just fail to pay the minimum wage and don't want to do it. It often can be inadvertent, and people that have come a cropper through this sort of thing are, for example, where they have staff sales and uniforms, where the cash for the purchase of goods is taken from salary, and that results in the workers going below the minimum wage rate, whereas if the workers had actually bought the discounted goods and paid for these separately, there wouldn't have been an issue. Training time also must be paid at least the appropriate national minimum wage rate for that person, and also travelling time during the day must be paid at least the national minimum wage rate. Those are the three main areas where there have been cases recently. We are aware of a couple of other statutory increases, i.e. the ones in statutory sick pay and the increase in family leave pay. And also, whilst we're looking at statutory increases, a quick note about auto-enrolment, because a lot of the smaller companies will now be coming into the final stages of auto-enrolment and reaching their staging dates. So it's important to note that for those that go for NEST, the government scheme, the previous restrictions on transfers in and out of the scheme and the annual contribution cap are expected to be removed as from April. That's what we know. What we don't know at the moment is whether there are going to be any increases in a week's pay for calculating redundancy or basic awards and the maximum compensatory award for unfair dismissal. I have been searching. I was desperately hoping I might have those figures for today's webinar, but can't find them yet. So do keep checking, especially if you're starting redundancy consultation now, because obviously April is not far off. Now we come to the meaty part of the webinar really, and with the best will in the world I am going to try and make gender pay gap reporting sound exciting, but this is quite technical and highly detailed, so those of you that do not have 250 employees, just breathe a sigh of relief and bear with us whilst I go through this bit, because the people that are going to come within the scope of gender pay gap reporting, you do need to know the differences that have been made to the regulations. We now have the final draft regulations. They're called the Equality Act 2010 Gender Pay Gap Information Regulations 2017. They're still subject to parliamentary approval, but they are unlikely to change now, and they're expected to come into force on the 6th of April. Now there are quite a number of changes from the original regulations that we ran quite detailed webinars on in the past, so it's the changes that I'm focusing on for the next few minutes. Now the regulations will apply to all private sector employers in England, Wales and Scotland who have 250 or more employees. Northern Ireland will have similar but separate legislation. And there are some quite significant changes from the original information, and it is quite technical, so I will be going into some detail here. Please, as I say, do bear with me on this one. So, employers with 250 employees or more will have to publish each year the pay difference between their male and female employees. And they will be concentrating on payments made in April of each year and also bonus payments made over the previous 12 months to April. Now the first thing to note in terms of changes is that the dates have changed. So the latest date that an employer can start reporting on its gender pay gap is now the 4th of April 2018. Previously it was the 30th of April. Yeah. Based on pay periods that include the 5th of April 2017. Again, previously the 30th of April. Bonuses paid from the 5th of April 2016 onwards will be included because you're looking back 12 months from the 5th of April 2017. So you have a year in which to prepare and to comply with this, but you will already be including data on bonuses that have already been paid. And the idea is that the information has to be published on your website and kept there for 3 years in a searchable place, presumably so that people can see progress or otherwise against this. So just a quick recap what this is all about. We're talking about the gender pay gap here, and according to the ONS, this currently is at 19.2%. It's been falling since 1997, as you can see from the graph, and you can also see that things are getting better, but that actually there's been very little change really since 2010. Payroll analysis in 2016 of 292 large companies who do track gender parity found 28.6% average pay gap in favour of men. However, all but 0.8% of this could be attributed to differences in seniority, in sector and in function. So the gender pay gap is not the same as equal pay. It's a different concept. Equal pay is a man and a woman who are doing the same job and who should get the same pay because they are doing the same job. Or the man and the woman are doing jobs which are regarded as being of equal responsibility. Yeah. In terms of gender pay, what we're talking about is the difference between what men actually earn and what women actually earn. So you may have equal pay, and you could well be paying, as you should be, the same rates of pay to a man or a woman doing the same job, but you still could have a huge gender pay gap if, for example, you have all of the men at the top of the pay structure and the women at the bottom, which is likely, or vice versa, which is less likely. So in that situation, you still could have a very big gender pay gap. So the employers that are covered by this are those who are in the private and voluntary sectors in England, Wales and Scotland, and who have at least 250 employees as at the 5th of April each year. So that's the snapshot date that we're now looking at. No longer looking at the 30th of April, we're looking at the 5th of April. The change will not affect data relating to monthly paid employees because the pay period will still be the same for the whole of April each year, but it could make a difference for weekly or fortnightly paid employees if payments such as bonuses or allowances tend to be paid at the beginning of the month rather than the end of the month because they would previously have been excluded. Yeah. In terms of employers, we're looking at partnerships, limited companies, LLPs. Yeah, each franchise, if you're in a franchise arrangement, will be regarded as a separate entity. So it may well be that you don't come within the scope of the regulations because you don't meet the 250 threshold. And also, if you have a group structure, then separate companies in a group will be regarded individually. So we do have some clients who have more than 50 employees within the group overall, but when you look at how many employees there are in each particular standalone company, they don't come up to the 250 threshold in any of those. Now, employees, relevant employees, also goes a little bit further than you may think, and that's another change from the draft regulations. Yeah. Employees includes all of those who work in Great Britain and whose contract is governed by UK legislation. So the definition that we're looking at is now the broad definition which was used in the Equality Act. So not only are relevant employees those who are working under a contract of employment or an apprenticeship, but it also includes workers, those who are required to provide their services personally. Now, previously these people were excluded, but this then ignored low-paid people on 0 hours contracts, for example, who are more likely to be women, so therefore they have now been brought within the scope of the regulations. Yeah. And workers also include contractors who are used to provide their services personally. So all of these people will count towards your 250 employee threshold. But anyone that's based outside of Great Britain or is genuinely self-employed or a member of an LLP or a partner, or people who are in sister companies or associated companies, they will not count towards your 250 threshold. Yeah. Okay, what is interesting there is that the regulations were changed to ensure that workers count towards the 250 threshold, but there's also a second addition, a new exception, which allows employers to exclude their pay data if you have workers for whom you do not have the data and you can't reasonably obtain it. So if you have self-employed people who are required to perform their services personally, but who actually send you an invoice and they don't work fixed hours and you don't know, you don't have the details of the time they've spent working for you, and they're not on your normal payroll system, then those workers should be included in the figure that says, do you have 250 employees? But thereafter you can actually forget about them and ignore them and exclude them from the data if you can't reasonably get that. Now, what has to be reported is now 6 pieces of information. Before, it was 5, yeah? So originally, when we were running webinars on this at this time last year, we were saying, well, you have to include your mean gender pay gap and your median gender pay gap, and the difference between the mean bonus payments paid to men and women. What has been added to that is we now also have the median bonus payments paid to men and women. And we have the proportion of men and women that received a bonus. Now, in terms of bonuses, we would take out, we're looking at bonuses paid over the previous 12 months, but we would only look at people who are still in your employment as at the 5th of April. So anybody who's been paid a bonus during that period but who has subsequently left, that data should be taken out of that figure. And then we also look at the number of men and of women in each quartile of the pay distribution. Basically, we have 4 bands, A, B, C, and D, with A being the lowest pay band and D the highest. So looking at those in a little bit more detail, the first job will obviously to work out what people were paid in April, because you need an hourly pay rate for each employee. Pay is the same definition as that used by the Office of National Statistics in the annual survey of hours and earnings, but there are some important changes from the original proposals here. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, if you have workers and you cannot get their pay data, then you do not have to include them within your figures if you can't reasonably obtain the pay data. Secondly, and this is quite a major change, we are now looking only at the pay for those who will receive full pay in April, not those who are on reduced or no pay. Now, that's probably in response to everybody's comments when the regulations were first published, because a lot of people pointed out that more women than men take family leave, and therefore you are likely to have more women than men who are receiving reduced pay whilst they're on maternity leave, adoption leave, shared parental leave, that sort of thing. Therefore, that could well affect your gender pay gap and could skew the pay gap. So people who are not on full pay should now be excluded from the pay data. It's not just as simple, though, as removing everybody who's absent from work during the relevant pay period in April, yeah, because you could have people who are on leave but who are still on full pay, and they would still be included. And the definition of pay now also includes any bonuses that have been paid in that pay period. Originally, bonuses were excluded from pay at this point, and if a bonus has been paid in the relevant pay period, let's say in April, but it's an annual bonus, then to prevent that from distorting the figures, only a share of the bonus payment that applies to the relevant pay period should be included in the calculation of the gross hourly pay of employees. So the government has been very helpful, and it's now told us that an annual bonus should be divided by 365.25 to get a daily rate, and then it should be multiplied by the length of the pay period. Now, if the pay period is a week, then that's 7 days, but interestingly, if it's a month, it happens to be 30.44 days. And any remuneration which is provided other than in money is excluded. So a car allowance, for example, would count as pay, but the provision of the car would not. When we're calculating gross hourly pay, we now have detailed guidance on how to do this. And the guidance says that where employees work the same normal working hours from week to week, then you would use their contracted hours. If their working hours differ from week to week, or there are no normal working hours, then you would use the average across the 12-week reference period ending with the last week of the relevant pay period. So the last 12 weeks, yeah. Interestingly, if this is not practicable, or alternatively, the employer is allowed to use a number which fairly represents the number of working hours in a week, having regard to the average hours worked by that employee and others in the same role. So in organisations where the senior management is predominantly male, the ability to use a deemed average day, which is longer than the contracted hours, but which actually does properly reflect the typical hours worked, will clearly result in a corresponding decrease to the hourly rate, and therefore may affect the size of the gender pay gap. Now, hours for which an employee is paid overtime are excluded from the figures, so they do not affect the hourly rate. You're going to need a way of reporting all of this, and most payslips do include all of the elements above, but they don't necessarily always separate them out. Many may well include overtime pay, which sometimes is split out, otherwise they simply state a total sum paid. Yeah. And you may also find that you have things like pay arrears, particularly, for example, if your pay review is late and you backdate it and then all of that amount is paid in April, then you will have to take out the pay arrears that don't apply to that period. Yeah? Or if you have pay for a different period, pay that's paid in advance, for example, that will need to be taken out so that you actually have a properly representative figure that is, this is what you should be paid in April, and we've taken out what you've been paid in advance, and we've taken out what's been paid in arrears. This is your April payment. Yep. So that's not quite as straightforward as you may originally think. When it comes to looking at the mean pay gap, then it's a comparison based on an average hourly rate for all women and for all men in that particular pay period. If you pay monthly, you're looking at the whole of April. If you pay weekly or fortnightly, then you're looking at the pay period in which the 5th of April falls. Part-time workers, no difference. What we're talking about here is you exclude people who are not on full pay, yeah, but it's not about people being full-time workers, it's full pay. 0 hours workers who earn nothing would be excluded, but casual workers who get their normal rate of pay would be included. And the figure that we come up with, which is a percentage, does not have to be broken down by role nor by hours. So it's just one straight figure, one percentage. The median pay gap is calculated using the same definition of pay and the same period and the same employees. So it includes both your full and part-time employees, but it will be a different figure, and it's thought to be the best indicator of the difference because using the median, i.e. the most popular, you rank everybody from low paid to high paid, and basically it's the middle rate, yeah, that's thought to be the best indicator of the difference because it removes the effect of having a few very high or very low earners at either end of the scale. Bonuses. Now, these are traditionally an area where men have done way better than women. The national gender bonus gap is 57%. The way that bonuses are defined is pretty wide. These include commission and securities, and we're looking at all bonuses paid in the 12 months from the 6th of April 2016 to the 5th of April 2017, but then with anybody who's left in the meantime being taken out of that. But we are looking at profit share, productivity bonuses, piecework, commission, long-term incentive schemes, and we're looking at anything that gives rise to taxable earnings or income in the relevant pay period. Now, the adjustment that requires employers to take out people who are receiving reduced or no pay during the snapshot month when you're working out the gross, the difference between median hourly rate and mean hourly rate does not apply when you're calculating the annual bonus data or the pay quartiles, but you would remove people that have left. Now the pay quartiles, this is probably the most difficult and possibly the most damning piece of information that you are required to publish. And we now know that this should be calculated by ranking all of the employees in order of hourly pay from the lowest to the highest and then splitting them into 4 equal-sized groups. Now, it wasn't clear originally whether you were splitting the pay range into 4 equal groups of equal size payments or whether you were splitting the number of employees into 4 equal sized groups, and it's now been confirmed we're looking at 4 equal sized groups of employees. And then we look at the proportion of male and female employees in each band and express that as a percentage. So that's clearly going to show the extent to which women are under or overrepresented in the higher and the lower paid jobs. You don't have to give actual pay ranges for this. And if you have a number of employees who receive the same hourly rate of pay and therefore they're straddling more than one quartile, then what the regulations say is you should be fair about this and make sure that you have the relative proportion of men and women the same in each pay band. Now, we have an example here. It's easy to explain in theory, but it's obviously going to take a while to gather all of this data together and to order it in a way that enables you to allocate people into the 4 quartiles. Yeah. The government estimated that it would take about 4 hours to become familiar with the regulations and 4 to 8 for training, but 13.5 to calculate. We think that that's wildly optimistic unless your payroll systems are very, very sophisticated and already set up for this. And in fact, before you even start the data, collecting the data, one of the things you might want to do is to talk to your payroll provider to see whether they are actually going to be enhancing any of their software to actually assist you to do this. You know, can you mark people who are going to be on reduced pay so that you can easily delete them from the data when it comes to looking at your snapshot payments for April, that sort of thing. Because if you could do it as you go along, it's going to be an awful lot easier, particularly for very, very large employers where the amount of work is going to be obviously much more. The figures, just to give you an example there, turquoise is women and blue is men. There are lots of women at the bottom, none in the middle, and a few at the top. Yeah, you don't have to show your data diagrammatically as we're doing here. This is just to emphasize the point of this example doesn't look too good in the sense of where the women are based in the organization, does it? And that's what people are going to be looking at. Now, because of that, there is no requirement to add any further narrative, but for a lot of employers that's going to be quite a sensible step to take. Yeah. The sort of employers that will wish to do this are particularly those who work in sectors where the gender pay gap is traditionally high, yeah, and where overtime pay is specifically excluded from the regulations. If overtime is a significant amount of remuneration, then it may well be that you need to include further voluntary details. You might want to look at sector or industry data because your own pay gap may be wide, but actually it may not be that bad when you compare it to other employers working within your environment or sector offer certain sorts of jobs. So it's a case of thinking who will be examining this once you actually publish it. You know, what are candidates going to think when they see this? What are your employees going to think? How will the unions react? What are your shareholders going to say? And is the media likely to have a field day with your figures? And if so, do you need to explain these so that people can see the figures in context and actually understand them properly? Particularly for those that have been trying very, very hard to address the gender pay gap and to do something about this. If they have made lots and lots of effort to recruit people into jobs where women are traditionally underrepresented, but they've been unable to do so, then it may well be worth adding extra details on here. Now, employers need to publish this data on their website for 3 years, presumably for comparison purposes, and it has to be accessible to employees and to the public, and it also has to be searchable, although unlike modern slavery statements, it doesn't have to be prominent. And if you don't have a website, then actually it seems that you're just going to need to set one up just for this, because you have to have it on a website. Yeah. It has to be signed, and it has to be in English. And in addition to this, as well as publicising your figures on your own website, the Secretary of State will designate a website to which all of the gender pay reports must be uploaded, including the name and the job title of the person who signed the statement. It remains unclear, though, whether the government is going to use this data to create sector league tables, which is something that was previously suggested. Now, if you don't do this, then at the moment there are going to be no civil or criminal penalties for non-compliance. But the Equality and Human Rights Commission may take enforcement action, so could investigate employers who fail to comply, which indicates to us that that may carry the future risk of an actual penalty for failure to comply. But the drivers for change here are going to be risk to damage to reputation, because those who fail to comply may be named and shamed, and those who do comply may suffer damage to their reputation if their gender pay gap looks particularly bad and there's no reason for it. It could well give a recruitment or retention advantage to those who are towards the top of their league table for a particular sector. Undoubtedly there's going to be pressure from the media, unions and employees, and that may well prove to be a more powerful incentive for change than the threat of legal penalties. But the government is also helping there. It's now just come up with a tool that employees can use to find the gender pay gap for their job. Yeah? So people will be looking at this. Now, the regulations are quite straightforward to read, but they are extremely detailed, and the final section commits the Secretary of State to reviewing the rules within the next 5 years, basically with a view to looking at whether they could be achieved with a system that imposes less regulation than this. And finally, on this point, there always was the plan to extend this to the public sector as well, but initially the regulations have been focused purely on private and voluntary sector. But earlier this week, the government published the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties and Public Authorities Regulations, and these will extend the duty to publish annual gender pay gap reports to public sector employers who also have over 250 employees. They're very, very broadly similar. So all the guidance that I've said before on how you do it and what has to be provided, that's all exactly the same. The main differences are that in terms of public sector employers, they already have an existing public sector equality duty. So this will form part of that rather than being a standalone requirement. And also, for some reason, which I'm not sure why, they have a different snapshot date. Okay. So for the rest of us, it's the 5th of April, but for public sector employers, it's the 31st of March. Okay, those who have less than 250 employees can now rejoin us and can just feel smug that they don't have to do all of that work, because there is a lot involved in gender pay gap reporting. So our next topic is still on pay, but perhaps a little less work to calculate. Now, this is the apprenticeship levy, which is expected to take effect from the 6th of April 2017, i.e. the new tax year. And basically all UK employers who have an annual wage bill of 3 million or more are going to be required to pay a 0.5% levy on their total pay bill, and that will be used to fund apprenticeship training. Now, it is payable by everybody, even if you don't have apprentices, but every employer has a 15,000 annual allowance, which actually means that in reality it's going to be less than 2% of employers who are actually going to have to pay this. Now, the employers that pay the apprenticeship levy will do this through the PAYE process that will report to HMRC, and they can then access levied amounts in their pot, plus a government top-up of 10% if they spend all of their levy, and they can use those funds to spend it on apprenticeships in England. And the smaller organisations who are not required to pay the levy can contribute 10% towards the cost of an apprenticeship, and the government will meet the cost of the rest. The levy doesn't affect the way employers fund training for apprentices who started their apprenticeships before the 1st of May 2017. But it will, the Digital Apprenticeship Service will be the people that administer the funding going forwards. Now, apprenticeship schemes are devolved in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, so different rules apply there. What is clear is that the levy will still apply, but it's not yet sure how they will access the money. Salary sacrifice schemes, changes to these. Now, this will apply to employers who offer benefits via salary sacrifice schemes, but it does not apply to salary sacrifice schemes which relate to pensions, to childcare, or to cycle to work schemes. Those schemes are entirely unaffected by what I'm saying now. The changes are to salary sacrifice schemes which, for example, private medical insurance or gym membership, or some of the more creative schemes like IT equipment and buying mobile phones. And these schemes will no longer be able to offer the same savings to employees on tax and national insurance contributions. Now, if you have schemes which were arranged before April 2017, then you can carry on with them for a year, but any new salary sacrifice schemes will fall under the new rules. Is it worth setting up a scheme now? Well, it's only going to last for a year if it does, so you've got the administration for that, and you may well feel that it's not worth it, but it is an option if you want to do that. For longer term arrangements, i.e. those that relate to cars or accommodation or school fees, if they're already in place, then the salary sacrifice benefits will continue until April 2021. There's nothing to stop you having the schemes, incidentally. You can always have the schemes, it's just that you won't get the same tax and national insurance benefits. And the aim behind all of this is to really prevent unfairness. It was the larger employers that tended to have the resources, both administrative and financial, to introduce more creative salary sacrifice schemes, and also tended to be the higher paid employers who were benefiting from them, because it was a very, very good way of making savings on tax and national insurance for things that you may well otherwise buy. As from now, when it comes to things like gym membership, it will be a case of you'd be paying the same as absolutely everybody else. No tax or national insurance saving on that. So that's the changes to salary sacrifice schemes. If it comes to foreign workers, specifically those who are in Tier 2, so employers who sponsor workers under Tier 2 are going to find that this becomes more expensive. There will be an immigration skills charge of £1,000 per employee from April 2017, but this is reduced to $364 for smaller employers and charities. Now, that's in addition to the fees for visa applications. So it's an extra charge on top. And of course, employers are also, most of them are meeting the national health surcharge as well, which now applies to workers from abroad. So it gets more expensive effectively. The minimum salary threshold to bring people over here under Tier 2 as well is going to rise to $30,000, and this is expected to be in April 2017. There are transitional arrangements for those who already have leave to remain under Tier 2 and for those who applied before the 25th of November 2016, but effectively the minimum salary threshold is going to be £30,000. Public sector exit payments. This webinar is largely based on pay, isn't it, and payment implications so far. This is the public sector exit payments, and we expected that as from April 2017, a cap of $95,000 would apply to payments that are made to public sector employees for the loss of their employment. So including redundancy pay, voluntary exit payments, or any other payments made due to the loss of employment. Now that cap will sit on top of a separate measure that's already in place that says that if you are working in the public sector and you earn more than £80,000 and you leave and then you return to a public sector role within 12 months, then you will be required to pay some or all of your exit payment depending on how long it is before you return to work. So 95,000 dates still to be absolutely confirmed, but we've been expecting April 2017 for quite some time now. And just a final note for everybody on exit payments, so this is private sector and public sector. HMRC has published draft provisions for the Finance Bill 2017, and that includes a reform of tax and NIC's treatment for termination payments. Now, if this is passed, then as from the 6th of April 2018, all payments in lieu of notice, whether they're contractual or non-contractual, will be taxed as earnings. So that gets rid of all the wording in our contracts that we may well need, giving us the right to make payments in lieu of notice, in the sense, well, sorry, the taxable implications of that. Contracts will still, however, you will still want to have pay in lieu of notice clauses if you are going to have restrictive covenants in your contracts, because you don't want to find that you're in breach of your own contract. But effectively, any payment in lieu of notice will be taxable. And the Foreign Service relief will be removed from those who have spent time working outside of the UK. And the government is also looking at aligning the tax and the employer NIC's treatment of termination payments so that employer NICs will be payable on the elements of any termination payment that's in excess of £30,000. So a termination payment on which income tax is due effectively. Data protection. Now, this will apply to all workforces, irrespective of their size, and we have coming into effect the EU General Data Protection Regulations, which has been mooted for some time now, but the date seems a long way, but actually it is starting to get closer. We're looking at the 25th of May 2018 for that. Now, that might seem an awful long way off now. We're looking at just over a year, but do note that it is likely that we will still be in the EU on that date. And therefore, because this is direct EU law, it will still apply in the UK until such time as we leave the EU. And even if the GDPR isn't retained by the Great Repeal Act on Brexit, then it will still continue to apply to any UK business which offers goods or services to or monitors the behaviour of individuals coming in the EU from the UK. Now, what are we going to have to do to prepare for this? Well, firstly, it may be a change to policies and procedures relating to subject access requests from individuals, because different rules will apply to those. Also, responses to any breach of the DPA, they're going to have to be dealt with very, very quickly, and privacy notices may well change. You will also need to check that you have the appropriate employee consent for the retention and processing of personal data which you keep about employees, as set out in the GDPR, which is slightly different to the Data Protection Act. And the fine for non-compliance with all of this is up to 20 million euros, or 4% of annual global turnover, whichever is the greater. So this is something that's not to be ignored. It's possibly something that merits a further webinar. Another of those gripping subjects, I'm afraid, but something that we do need to take seriously because the fines for non-compliance are so large. But we do need to start thinking about this one. Employment status and rights, are there any changes there? Well, the BEIS ran an inquiry into the future world of work. That closed on the 19th of December, and we're waiting for a report. And that was looking at the changing nature of work, in particular people working in the gig economy, and looking at, for example, 0 hours contracts and the balance of benefits between workers and employees, minimum wage enforcement, and whether the unions were working for these sort of people or not. Separately, the Work and Pensions Committee had an inquiry to look at whether the UK welfare system is adequately supporting these sorts of workers, the gig economy workers, and how this might be adapted to suit their needs. And the Office of Tax Simplification is also looking at this, because tax issues are raised by gig working in a number of ways, especially because a person's status for tax and for employment rights are not always the same. So there could well be some changes regarding non-typical working arrangements over the scope of this year. And finally, we have a change to modern slavery statements. Now, I mentioned earlier when we were looking at what happened in 2016 that as from the 31st of March 2016, organisations that have a turnover of 36 million or more are required to develop and publish a modern slavery statement each year. Now, the Modern Slavery, Transparency and Supply Chains Bill 2016 is going to take this one step further, because what it will do is it will require contracting authorities to exclude companies from their buy-in procedures if they are a relevant organisation, i.e. they have a turnover of 36 million or more, and they haven't published a modern slavery statement. So what started out as regulations that had no real teeth other than the threat of a bad reputation or bad media coverage are now starting to become something far more important, actually. And finally, we can't have a webinar without mentioning Brexit, and we don't have too much to say about that at this stage, you'd be relieved to know, other than just watch this space. Theresa May's speech last week didn't throw up any major new concerns for HR professionals, because we know that things are going to carry on as they are for the time being. Yeah? But what we do know now is that the Supreme Court did rule that the government cannot trigger Article 50 by itself. They have to have a vote from Parliament to do this. So that will have to go through both the Commons and the Lords, which may delay the process by some amount anyway. And we also know, because of figures that the Home Office has released, is that there's been a huge increase in applications from EU nationals to stay permanently in the UK. Applications from the EU and 4 other countries rose by 83% in the 6 months to September compared with the previous 6-month period. But the number of new employees from the EU has dropped from July onwards. So if you are relying on recruiting workers from the EU, then there are less people coming here, is the message. What do you do with all of this? We mentioned an awful lot that relates to increases in pay and extra costs for employers. So the first thing really has to be to start budgeting for the above changes if you haven't already done so. Many relate to increases in rates or increased charges or increased administration. So do consider how the above changes may affect you, and also do keep an eye out for our monthly newsletters. We do try to keep you up to date with everything as and when we learn of it. I think that's rather a lot. It has been a whistle-stop tour and we are running out of time, but Sue, do we have any particular questions that you'd like to cover?
There is just one question perhaps to ask you. It's to do with the apprenticeship levy.
Yep.
Do we know if the government will only top up if all the levy funds are used?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, I would assume so.
Yeah, that's my understanding
Yeah.
anyway, yeah. Yeah,
And
it's only if you've spent all of your levy funds that then you can then apply to have the extra
the
amount.
next bit. Yeah, and another question which I think we might be able to answer
Oh,
is...
sorry, before I go off that one as well, effectively you have your own pot. It's a bit like a sort of personal pension scheme from that point of view. You pay in and it sits in a pot there for you to use, yeah? But if you don't use that within 18 months, then it gets redistributed.
Okay. Presumably
Sorry.
top up.
Top of somebody else, yes,
Yeah.
quite.
And another part to that question was, when will the top up be given, on a monthly basis or an annual basis? Would it be done through the
Oh gosh, no, I don't know the
payroll?
answer to that one actually. If whoever asked that question could leave their name with us, we'll do some research into that and get back to you on that one.
Okay, I've made a note, so we will get back to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it for now, thank you. And we've also run out of time, so thank you very much.
Lovely. Well, and thank you very much everyone for joining us for what has actually been quite a technical, quite a detailed session, but we do appreciate your interest, we do appreciate your questions, and we will aim to keep you in touch with everything as things develop. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon.